money man.
The translations, I think, are going to be a little interesting today, indeed. Is that up and running? It is. Okay, so let's park that over there. All right, I think everything is in its place. Good afternoon, Natan. People are logging in for YouTube and in Zoom.
Good afternoon, Rabbi. We have a high expectation after your advertising of controversial topic.
Well, you know, some people avoid controversy, but I know that for most Jews, it's an attraction. So we'll see. We'll see what people make of today's topic. I don't think I oversold it, but we'll find out.
Now I am intrigued. I missed the sales pitch.
Oh, are you not? You don't use our WhatsApp group?
No.
Ah,
That's okay. I'm now intrigued. Let's.
Of what could there be controversial in chapter 17 of Vayikra of Leviticus? I mean, it's a pretty boring chapter, right? We shall see.
Yeah, no, there's some very different grammatical things happening here that leap out at me. As I said, the ish, the mention of the proselyte or sojourner. There's something unusual happening here.
Now that shows that you've been paying attention to the way that our tradition tries to analyze text, that we don't just gloss through things. All right, we're just going to give it one more second, and then we will begin our discussion. All right, I think we've given plenty of time for those who are planning to attend to arrive. And if they're not here yet, well, they can always watch the rerun. So good afternoon to everyone. And it's nice to have you all here for this study of Leviticus 17. Now, Vayikra as a whole doesn't get a lot of excitement for many of the people who want to read it. However, this week's parshiot of Acharei and Kedoshim can get lots of attention for other chapters. Chapter 17 really does not ever stand out as being the belle of the ball. It is the Anne Peggy of Hamilton fame for these chapters. It doesn't have any of the holiness code. It doesn't have the issue of sexual immorality. It doesn't have the high pageantry of the Yom Kippur service. Instead, it's kind of just sitting here in an odd way. And anytime something is that boring, you know there's got to be something else going on, because the Torah never bothered to give us anything that was just dull. God did not give us the Torah to help with insomnia. God gave us the Torah to help us know how to live life. And even though some of the topics in chapter 17 will not have an immediate applicability to our life, we're no longer offering sacrifices, hopefully you'll see from the discussion of it and its commentary that there is much going on here that needs to be talked about. So with that as our introduction, let us get down to the text, use it as our launch board for commentary, and then see where that leads us. So it begins mundane enough. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, and I do remember from my mother in her days of religious school educator, that when she would ask bar mitzvah students what their Torah reading was, that many of them couldn't remember the chapter or name of the parasha, but they could always say, well, it begins, Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. Unfortunately, as she tried to point out to them, that covers about 70% of the Torah. So we do need a little bit more of what is being talked about in this chapter. Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. If anyone of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or sheep or goat in the camp, or does so outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the Lord's tabernacle, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood. That man shall be cut off from among his people. Now, before we go further, there's a lot going on here that needs to be discussed. So first of all, we have this, the doubling of ish, as John, you and I were talking about as the class began. Excuse me. We're going to come back to that in more detail in the commentary, but ish is a not uncommon Hebrew phrasing for trying to be this applies to everyone kind of terminology, which is why the translation defines it as if anyone. But it is, of course, literally saying man, or person, which is definitely sounds weird as a literal translation. But like I said, the commentaries will bring us up to speed on some of the ways we can interpret that phrase. What is the general topic here? Well, the general topic is that it is trying to, in the eyes of our tradition, prohibit extra altar sacrifices, meaning that a person should not give an offering to God outside of the official place, in this case, the tent of meeting, Ohel Moed, where the altar, where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was constructed. Now, that seems to be indicating that every time you want to slaughter an ox, a sheep, or a goat, something that is fit for the altar, that it needs to be done at the altar. But it seems to be unclear whether or not this is talking about it as a sacrifice per se, or whether this is talking about it even if you want to slaughter it for dinner. I'll go ahead and give the spoiler warning. Our tradition tells you that this is only for sacrifices, and that if you are doing it for food, that there is a different requirement of what we do with the blood. However, there has been some argument with the academic world where they try to argue that this is one tradition which said every animal had to be brought to the temple and otherwise you were vegetarian, and reconciling it with the Deuteronomical tradition, which says that if you live too far away from the temple, of course you're allowed to eat animals without bringing anything to the temple if it's just for food. We are going to be assuming that our tradition is correct because it got us through 3,000 years, and that this is talking only about sacrificial animals, and in general trying to rule out making a sacrifice away from the altar of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, later Jerusalem. Well, eventually Jerusalem. There was a lot of in between as well. So it seems to be a very strong focus here that if one person were to slaughter the animal outside of that particular location, that would be a problem, specifically because of the shedding of the blood, that the blood that should have been sprinkled on the altar is not being sprinkled on the altar. So that's where we're going to pick up now as we scroll down to verse 5. This is in order that the Israelites may bring the sacrifices which they have been making in the open, that they may bring them before the Lord to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to the Lord. So again, this is clarifying, and our tradition takes this as being very much at face value, that these are for sacrifices and only sacrifices, which up until this point, people had basically been making wherever they wanted to make them. And now they are going to make them at the place of the tent of meeting. And the phrase making them in the open is more literally translated as in front of the field, meaning, in the great wide open, hence the translation. And now they are going to be brought to God. This is seen as being, of course, a much stronger elevation of the process, but more importantly, an exclusive process, meaning that we are only going to be bringing things to the altar of the Mishkan. We are not going to be bringing them wherever we happen to feel like it. And then what happens when that occurs? Verse 6, that the priest may dash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord. We've already know that the blood and the fats, certain fats, are not allowed to be eaten, and therefore could only be offered on the altar. So this, of course, would mean that all of that fat from that sacrifice had to go in this way. 7, and that they may offer their sacrifices no more to goat demons after whom they stray. This shall be a law to them for all time throughout the ages. All right, so if you're not familiar with the whole issue of goat demons, the Seirim that they're talking about here, yeah, our ancestors and other people of the ancient world, they thought stuff. They had some beliefs about different spirits and other powers in the world that also demanded sacrifices that needed to be fed, almost literally, with some of these offerings. And so, of course, you know, you'd offer to God, but you'd also go offer to the goat demons. You'd also go offer to other things. And that was normal in the pre-Torah world. The Torah is saying, no more. No. If you are making a sacrifice, you're doing it here at the altar in front of me, so we can be sure that it is going correctly and that you're not offering it to some fanciful idea of other entities. So this is a very strong reminder that the sacrificial service as being instituted by the Torah is trying to limit the creative theology of the ancient world. It's trying to cut out all of the really the wild imagination of the ancient people, our own ancestors included, and restrict it in order to prevent this sort of thing from becoming or continuing to be so commonplace. How much that succeeded? Well, we unfortunately know that from the days of the kings that people were still sacrificing in all of these wild ways. But at least we had teaching to try and guide us away from that. And eventually we got the picture. You know, 1,000 years later, we got rid of most of this type of idolatry. But here we see the Torah trying to steer us in the right direction. We're just slow learners. Is everyone with me so far? Okay. Ironically enough, we are not going to be going into much detail about these Seirim, the goat demons. I've talked about them in other lessons. So we're going to be finding something else to fixate on. Verse 8. Say to them further, if anyone, another ish again, of the house of Israel, or of the strangers who reside among them, offers a burnt offering or a sacrifice. Wait, so hold on. Who are these? Who is this ger? Who is this stranger that is living among us? Now, it's one of the great features of Hebrew that gets lost in translation is that the word ger is the same word that's being used for residing in this particular case. Right? It's the ger asher yagur. It is the ger that gers, if you were going to put this in English, or the stranger who strangers, or who stranges among them. It is we really don't, the sojourner, that's one of the terms that I've sometimes seen used, the sojourner who sojourns. But since no one knows what the word sojourn means in English anymore, we might as well stick with the Hebrew. So ger is a word that has a great deal of semantic range. That's the fancy way of saying it can mean lots of different things, both in context as well in different time periods of Jewish history. In the modern world, and for most of the last 1,000 years plus, the term ger has been used rabbinically to mean somebody that has converted, to somebody who has become Jewish, a person that has moved into the Jewish faith officially. However, that phrase seems awkward here in verse 8, because if we are talking about somebody who is already Jewish, then of course the rules that apply to Beit Yisrael would also apply to somebody who has joined the house of Israel through the process of conversion. On the other hand, if we are talking about a true stranger, in the sense that a non-Jewish person who happens to be among Israel, who happens to be living in the land, why are they offering a sacrifice? Well, the answer to that is fairly easy. In antiquity, people would often offer sacrifices to the locally worshipped God, meaning that if somebody happened to be traveling through the land of Israel, or even living there for a while, they would probably want to make a sacrifice to whoever the local big shot was. In this case, God, capital G God, obviously. And this might be only trying to tell us that it is a rule for those that are part of that transitory population, of how they too can, in some ways, participate in the sacrificial service. And now that may sound surprising to you, but indeed, it is clear, not so much from the commentary on this verse, as we'll see, but from many other places in the Torah, that non-Jews indeed could participate in the sacrificial service. There were certain limitations and qualifications to that, but they did have a way to participate. But that is not the way our tradition is going to read this particular verse. So we're going to put a question mark on this and come back to what kind of ger are we talking about in this verse. But let's continue with the rules. And if they bring the sacrifice and they do not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from his people. So we see that, again, that whoever the second category of person is, that like the Israelite, they can only be brought to this place. And if they are not, that they will suffer the punishment of karet. Now, karet is a great word with wide semantic range. It literally means to be cut off. And here, as you can see, it's being cut off from his people, well, technically peoples. The ne'amav is the plural suffix, possessive suffix, which we will get back to in our commentary. But what does it mean to be cut off? Some people read this as being analogous to a modern form of excommunication, of you will be shunned. However, that is not the way that the Torah really leans towards understanding, and it is definitely not the way that Rabbinic Judaism understands it, where this cutting off is considered to be a spiritual excision, that you will be cut off really from being part of the community vis-a-vis God, meaning that God will cut you out of the loop, and that cutting out of the loop can mean up to and including death. Importantly, death by the hands of heaven, not death at the hands of the court, which is, of course, handled very differently. Let's continue. We got a lot of text to get through before we can see our commentary. And if any one of the house of Israel, again, ish, or the strangers who reside among them, again, hagar, partakes of the blood, I will set my face against the person who partakes of the blood, and I will cut him off from among his kin. So we see that it's not only for the sacrifice, but it is also for the eating of the blood that the person is being cut out from. And this applies again to the Beit Yisrael, the house of Israel category, and the ger category. Why? Verse 11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have assigned it to you for making expiation for your lives upon the altar. It is the blood as life that affects expiation. So this notion of dam being central to the concept of nefesh, the concept of life itself. Nefesh is often translated as soul, but it can also mean more generally to be alive, is a very powerful and common usage of the term throughout Torah. And indeed, that is why the spilling of blood, whether it be of an animal or of another person, is taken so seriously throughout the entire Torah. And here it is reminding us that the spilling of an animal's blood is still important, and especially if it is being done in a worshipful form, that it can only work if it is at the altar, and then it is used for making the kapara, for making atonement. Therefore I say to you, the Israelite people, no person among you shall partake of the blood, nor shall the stranger who resides among you partake of the blood. So we get, again, this idea of all of the house of Israel, as well as the ger hagar, this resident alien, is being ruled as not allowed to eat the blood. Now, the chapter continues, repeating these categories again, our ish, our b'nai Yisrael, our ger hagar, talking about hunting and other usages, but I don't want to lose the time we need for our discussion. So just suffice for the moment to say that it repeats a similar type of ruling with regards to what we do with hunted animals. Hunting is a particularly unusual circumstance, but I don't want to get down that rabbit hole. By the way, rabbits are not kosher. Okay, so any questions before we jump to our commentary?
Rabbi, I'm noticing as well that we're going from ish to nefesh. And that seems to be part of what's going on here. There's a distinction being made in the text.
Indeed, and that distinction is what is going to eventually, I believe, confuse some of the commentary about how to handle this. This interplay between ish of these any person, as well as the interplay between nefesh, meaning both soul as well as a life, and the use of the word dam, of blood throughout, is very confusing. And we're going to see attempts to clarify that, some that are more successful than others. Let me just leave it as that as for our introduction. So let's go ahead then and jump into our conversation and see how this plays out in our traditional commentary first. So first, Rashi. Rashi is always good to start with because he at least brings what could be considered a standard interpretation. So what is he talking about? All of this sacrifice away and eating the blood away. What's going on here? This is intended to declare one who burns the limbs of sacrifices outside of the forecourt to be liable to the penalty of excision. That's our term karet, of being cut off, just as the same as he who slaughters a sacrifice outside the forecourt. So it's not only the slaughtering that means that you're in trouble, but also the burning of something another person slaughtered. So that if one person slaughtered a sacrifice outside the forecourt and another brought it upon the altar to burn it, both are liable to excision. So this redundancy, Rashi is arguing, based off the traditional commentary, as we'll see, is trying to make sure that we cover everybody involved in this, not only the person who did the initial slaughtering. Now, because Rashi is still a little unclear, Siftei Chachamim, which, as I've mentioned, is a super commentary about Rashi, meaning it's a commentary about Rashi's commentary, they jump in to explain. You might ask, what does "who will bring a burnt offering" come to prohibit, right? Why have this additional phrase? If it is to prohibit slaughter outside, sacrifices outside, it already said each and every person, who will slaughter, as we saw in verse 2. So that seems redundant. So what is it coming to do? What function does it have in our teaching if we've already taught that don't slaughter away from the altar teaching? Rashi explains that it comes to make liable one who burns limbs outside as one who slaughters outside. That is, even though someone already slaughtered it outside and disqualified the sacrifice, and you might have thought that someone who offered it after this invalid slaughtering would incur no transgression because the first person had already disqualified it, the verse teaches that they both transgressed and both are liable. So unpacking the Rashi, as I already tried to do, but of course they do a better job because it is their great skill, trying to explain what it was about the text that made Rashi need to make the comment and how the comment actually clarifies something that we might have missed if we hadn't had the text clarified for us in this way. And again, this is based off the assumption that I've mentioned many other times, that traditional Jewish commentary believes that there is no such thing as unnecessarily redundant phrases in the Torah. If something seems to be teaching two identical things with no addition or clarification or added emphasis or anything else, then you're misreading it. There's got to be some other element to it. And that indeed is what we are getting by this additional explanation of prohibiting of the slaughter and of burning it. Now, the karet as the punishment seems very strange. And indeed it is strange, and that's why Rashi needs to comment on it. cut off. Well, what does this mean? It means his offspring are cut off. That is to say, they die out, and his, meaning the actual transgressor, his days are shortened. So why would we think that his offspring might be die for this, in addition to his own days being shortened, again, at the hand of heaven, not something that is put in motion by humans? Well, Siftei Chachamim to the rescue again. From his peoples, here in the text, in the plural form, implies to some degree that there are many sorts of excision. There is karet and there is karet. There is a difference between excision and death. Death is decreed on the individual person, whereas excision in this variety cuts off him and his children. Death does not affect one's children because so is the way. A generation goes and another generation comes, right? Judaism doesn't really go in for the whole idea of death moving on from one person to the next. But excision results in the person being cut off from the root of life. And the fruit is afflicted as well, because when a tree's root is removed, the fruit too is afflicted with it. So the idea here is that when a person has committed a transgression that requires karet as the only appropriate punishment, and for which again he hasn't repented and fixed, but assuming it's left undone, then that will create a spiritual death in the person, and the spiritual death of a person will have a spiritual death on the lineage that is from that person, that we are intimately connected to the roots that have given us our shape and form, that we as fruit are linked back to the roots of the prime tree. So Siftei Chachamim is arguing, that Rashi is arguing, that because of the plural form of excision, he will be cut off from his peoples, that this is trying to remind us of this trans-temporal impact, that a person is having an effect not only on themselves, but also on those to come because of their behavior. Now, that kind of idea that things will have an effect across time feels weird in the modern world, because we're used to more or less banal theories of physics. But the idea that how we behave will have a spiritual ripple and implication into our children should not seem terribly unusual, given that we are of the belief that God and the true realm of spirit and holiness is beyond, before, after, and during, is beyond the regular regulations of time. However, even all of that is not the oddest or strangest elements of this chapter. That is going to go back to our unusual ish and hagar and all of those elements of why this very unusual, clunky, and seemingly superfluous repetition of phrasing. So for that, we're going to go to Sifra. Now, Sifra is one of the oldest collections of bite-sized, verse-by-verse commentary on the Torah, in order to, specifically the book of Leviticus, in order to deduce the actual halakha, the actual laws from those verses. By the time we reach the Mishnah, and certainly by the time we're in the Talmud, the assumptions of Sifra have already been mostly absorbed as the root explanation of why the primary laws are there, and then Mishnah and Talmud are commentary upon that understanding. Sometimes it will be rehashed in those books, but by and large, maybe 80% or more has already been assumed as this is the law according to the original Torah's message, as we can deduce from a careful analysis of the words. Because of that careful analysis of the words, a lot of people do not enjoy Midrash Halakha, this type of Halakha, and that's why I don't bring it too often. However, occasionally, things just demand that I share. And whether you're enjoying it or not, sometimes you just get what the particular teacher really feels needs to be shared. So, what does Sifra share on this section for us? And to them you shall say, a man, the ish, from the house of Israel, and the strangers that shall dwell among them, in their midst, betocham, who shall offer up a burnt sacrifice. So let's analyze that by pieces. And to them shall you say. What does that mean? In respect to the foregoing, meaning you need to remind this group or these groups based on what we said before. Israel, all right, that means the congregation of Israel. Strangers, that means converts. We are talking about people who are proselytes, who have become officially Jewish. That shall dwell, the betocham part, that is actually there to include the wives of converts. And in their midst, that is there to also include the women of the bondsmen, right? So that shall dwell, sorry, I misspoke, that is talking about the hagur part. And then the betocham in their midst is there to include the women and bondsmen. What are we talking about here? So what the Sifra seems to be saying directly by itself, and as we'll see, the commentary gets a little bit more head-scratching, but by itself, the Sifra seems to be saying that our phrase ish ish is meant to be understood to be 100% all-inclusive. That whether a person is a native-born Israelite, or is a convert, or is the wife of a convert, or is a woman, or is a bondsperson, meaning an indentured servant among the Jewish people, all of them follow the same rule, that there is one rule applicable to all of them in this case. And the language is clunky, yes, maybe from a modern perspective, but it is there to rule out the misconception that perhaps this rule only applies to some of these categories. Instead, we should take from it that this category, that this rule applies to every category you might possibly imagine among the Jewish people for the limits on how they can and cannot do sacrifices. All right. So everyone following the logic of the Sifra, again, it's always written very short, which means it takes a lot more explanation, but I hope I didn't leave anything out. All right, so part 2, technically the third paragraph in this particular chapter, and who shall offer up a burnt offering? What does this mean? This tells me only of a burnt offering, a particular type of sacrifice. Whence do I derive the same for the devoted portions of a sin offering and of a guilt offering and of the Holy of Holies and of lower order offerings? Like, okay, so you only mentioned the burnt offering. How do I know that it also applies to other sacrifices from or a sacrifice, right? The fact is, it says that they offer up a burnt offering or a sacrifice. If that second phrase or a sacrifice hadn't been there, then I might have thought that the rules only applied to a burnt offering. The second phrase is there, therefore I know it applies to every sacrifice. And whence do I derive the same for the blood, which was also included in all the sacrificial services? Also from or a sacrifice, meaning that phrase is also telling us in general about the rule restricting of how blood can be eaten or not eaten and how it can be used. Okay, so we can see from this part of Sifra that they are very intent on being expansive, inclusive, of making sure that the interpretation of these verses will apply to as broad a range of categories of people or actions as possible, so that a person cannot say, well, maybe there's a loophole. Maybe if I get my slave to do the sacrifice, and maybe if it's not a burnt offering, but if it's a sin offering, then maybe I'm not breaking the rules. And Sifra is saying, no, the Torah was written very carefully, and boom, 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 all of that is mentioned at least implicitly, and therefore there are no loopholes to this. Any sacrifice by any person, off limits if you're not doing it right. Following? Okay. But there are other ways to look at this. And let's go ahead and look at another section from Sifra. This is from section 7, paragraphs 1 and 2. And a man, again our ish, from the house of Israel and from the stranger that sojourns among them, that shall eat any blood, I shall set my face against the soul that eats the blood, and I shall cut it off from the midst of its people. Israel, right? That's our first category after the ish inclusion parentheses. This means the congregation of Israel, exactly like we saw before. The stranger, that means people who converted, that's sojourns, that's including their wives. In the midst, that includes women and bondspeople in general. If so, if all have been accounted for, why is it written then, a man, right? Okay, you tell me that from the house of Israel all the way to the end covers every possible category, then why did I need the introduction of ish? Well, that also, says Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, to include the child of an Israelite woman by a Gentile or by a bondsman. You might have thought that these people who are born from this special category, where you have an Israelite woman who has a child that was sired by a non-Jew or by a slave, that maybe that child would fall between the cracks, would be of special nuanced category, and therefore you found a loophole that it doesn't apply to. The ish comes as a way of saying any possible combination, version, etc. is ruled out, and this rule applies to all of them. And even the more esoteric ways that a child can be born with a complicated status or family tree, they are still all covered by this rule. Okay, everyone got that? So that's what Sifra is saying. And that is what the Mishnah builds off of, and the Talmud builds off of, and Halakha builds off of. Again, not that we are actually engaged in burnt offerings, but we do still avoid eating the blood. And indeed, the rule against eating blood applies to everyone. It's not a male-only rule. It's not a male plus converts rule. It is nobody gets to eat the blood. However, while doing my research for this, I came across a commentary that really went a little bit into left field. And as we're going to see, some of the things that he says are rather surprising. Some of them I will also point out, I believe, are incorrect. I have the audacity to say that a commentary from the early 1700s, I believe, is trying to establish something that I disagree with, based off verses incorrectly. But even more importantly, as I will argue before we're done, is the translation goes further than the original in its error. And when I went back to double check the Hebrew from the translation, I found that the translator had taken some rather important and very problematic liberties in how he was converting the Hebrew into intelligible English. So let's go ahead and get started. We're looking at Or HaChaim, which, as I mentioned, is a commentary from the 1700s, early 1700s, and he's got something to say. So he sees in this Ish, B'nai Yisrael, Ger, and all of that, he sees this as a list of different levels of sanctity. Now, this is a Kabbalistic term that is used by some, and it doesn't always mean what you think it means. However, what it seems to mean here is still very problematic, in my opinion. Let's go ahead and see what he's describing, talk about what he probably meant in and of itself, and then we'll see some of the implications and problems with it. So the highest level, this is the level of sanctity of Kedusha, belongs to the Israelite males. The second highest belongs to their wives, seeing that a female soul is not on the same level of spirituality as that of a male. Now, first of all, what have we already had as a problem here? We've moved from the issue of sanctity to spirituality. Now, that's one translation issue that I think is rather problematic. The terms sanctity and spirituality mean different things in English than they do. They're not interchangeable. So to translate the word kedusha, holiness or sanctity, is perfectly fine as holiness or sanctity. But to translate that same term as being spirituality in English is very misleading. In English, the term spirituality implies the spiritual capability of a person, whereas sanctity implies a level of distinction or often responsibility of a person. Indeed, the holiness codes of the rest of the book of Kedoshim talk about the sanctity of the Jewish people, not because we are more capable of spirituality, but because we have more requirements to be responsible for that which we must do to be holy in the eyes of God. Non-Jews are not as encumbered by the commandments as we are. And that means that we have a higher threshold to meet in order to be considered living up to the level of life that God has asked us to have. Now, in traditional Jewish counting of requirements, somebody who was a man had more requirements than someone who was a woman. I've talked about this in other classes, in particular my Pathway to Judaism class on the role of women in Judaism. But short version is that traditional Judaism believed that since women, by the social economic system, not necessarily by religious requirement, but by the requirement of society, were often dependent upon men, that they were not able to exercise their own discretion and their own use their own time as freely as a man could. Therefore, women were exempted from many of the positive time-bound commandments. That, I believe, is what Or HaHaim was trying to hint at in this particular question. However, it does get a little bit more complicated before he's done. And that then becomes where certain mystic ideas begin to meet certain legal ideas, and oftentimes the offspring is not viable in my opinion. So let's go ahead and see where he takes this to. With that in mind, that we're talking about this notion of kedusha, not spirituality, despite what the translation has said so far. So we have men, we have Israelite men, we have Israelite women. The next lower level is that of the son between a natural-born Jewish father and a proselyte, between somebody who was an Israelite and a ger. Now, the term that's being natural-born and proselyte is, again, a little bit confusing. It could easily have been translated as between an Israelite and a stranger. Now, the term ger, like I said, in most of rabbinic history for the last 1,000+ years, has referred to converts. So I do believe that Or HaHaim was probably talking about somebody who converted, and that would create a different level of whatever we're talking about here. Next in line of sanctity from birth is the son of a proselyte married to a natural-born woman. So we're seeing that he's saying if you are the son between a Israelite and a ger, that you have higher status than if you are the son of a Yoret, of a female convert, and if you are the son of a male convert from an Israelite woman. Now that begins hopefully to set off a few head-scratching alarm bells. That basically it's not just of which one, if you had a non-Jewish parent, but instead he is saying that the nature of the non-Jewish parent makes a difference. That being born from a Jewish, and the term is really misleading, but from an Israelite from birth father somehow confers more status than if you were born from a converted Jewish father, even if your mother was Israelite from birth. That's very problematic because we don't see anywhere in halakha where there is any distinction made between any of these categories. Yes, as I mentioned at the outset, there are some distinctions made between the requirements, the mitzvot that are incumbent upon a person between men and women, in the ancient world at least. But the other distinctions that he's talking about do not appear in Jewish law, except in some extremely rare circumstances. More on that if you want to study Yevamot with me in the Mishnah class. Next in line is the female proselyte, daughter of either of the two last mentioned unions, meaning that if you are a girl born from the mother, father, father, mother combos we just said, then you are lower than the son born from either of those two unions. And below this is the son of a union between a male proselyte and a female proselyte, meaning that you are born from two parents who both converted. Next in line is the sanctity from birth, is the daughter born from a union between the male and female proselyte. Finally, there is the level of the proselyte himself, meaning if you are the first generation convert, then you are at the bottom of this list. Now, it may be some consolation to recognize that in Or HaChaim's eyes, all of this list was higher than somebody who wasn't Jewish. But as you can see, this is an extremely troubling and problematic teaching, and one which has no basis in Jewish law itself. Somebody who converts according to Jewish law explicitly as taught in every Jewish law code, as well as all of the original texts, says if a person converts, they have the same status as somebody who was born Jewish. It's no ifs, ands, or buts. The requirements are the same and everything else is the same. And indeed, in the Sifra itself, we saw that the whole point of the Ish giant establishment of the set theory of who's involved was there to make sure everybody was in the same bucket, that everybody was covered by the same rubric. So what is he trying to say here? Well, first let's look at his proof, and then we'll go from there. Now, as always, whenever somebody brings proof, that means that they think that it demands proof that this is not universally agreed upon, in which he's right. It is not universally agreed upon. All of the above mentioned levels are alluded to in the Torah at some point or other. The first and highest category of sanctity from birth is spelled out in the Baraita of Torat Kohanim, that's Sifra, when they interpret the word Yisrael in our verse as a reference to a male, natural-born Israelite. So he is taking, I'm going to flip up, I'm not going to do this too often because it's hard on the screen and hard on the eyes, but he is saying that because of the way the Sifra was written, by actually saying that each part of the list was including another person, that was not to prove that Ish included everyone and just spelling it out for you. That was to tell you that each one was actually different than the other ones. They may all fall under the same rule, but they have a different status vis-a-vis their holiness. Now, that is a stretch, in my humble opinion, to imagine that the Sifra, which seems to be explicitly including everyone in its definition of these verses, is actually trying to say by its inclusion that each one is separate, seems to be reading the teaching that Sifra was giving us completely backwards. It is trying to reconstruct a hierarchy that was actually being destroyed in the text itself. The text was there to say we're all the same, and he's reading it to say because it's saying men, women, children are all the same, you should therefore think men, women, and children are actually different on a holiness level, even if they're not different on a legal level. That's problematic logic from my opinion. He goes on to try and prove proselytes, converts are mentioned twice in that paragraph when the words Hager, Hagar are understood as referring to two separate types of proselytes. Now, you will have noticed that that was not mentioned specifically in our text. However, he sees the doubling as being a doubling of groups. You will also find that in Sukkah 28, they interpreted the letter of He in the word Ha'ezrach, the proportion, as including the wives of proselytes. This teaches us that the letter He in the word Hagar, or rather Hager, is to be understood as an additional dimension of the word Ger. So if the He can be added in the other place, then the He can be added here. This means that the words Hager, Hagar in our verse really include 4 different kinds of combinations of proselytes, which is why he had his 4 different versions up at the top of his list. When the author of Sifra went on to write that the word among them refers to the wives and slaves, he meant natural-born Jewish wives and slaves whose status in Jewish halakha is the same as that of women. All right, so do we have the right to argue with commentary from the past? Yes. Why do we know we have that right? Because the commentaries all argue with themselves as well. Now, it may be audacious for Rabbi Neely to argue with Or HaChaim, and indeed I often agree with much of his other translation or rather other interpretation, but I definitely disagree with him here. But all sages and all rabbis and all Jews are allowed to debate, discuss, and argue, especially the non-halachic implications. Even the halachic implications, the legal implications, are open for debate in many, many points. That's why there are Sephardic, Ashkenazic, and other differences of of traditions from different communities in the application of Jewish law. But certainly in this level of theological interpretation, absolutely we are within our rights as Jews and students of the text to say, you know, Or HaChaim, I think you're making this a stretch. I think trying to spell out that there is some sort of distinction that matters between these different categories and some level of sanctity doesn't really work. And you might have been mainstream if you'd just been talking about halachic obligations, and that as being a higher level of requirement, and that means a higher level of sanctity, not because they're better, but because it's harder to achieve. But once you start going down the differentiation between converts and non-converts, you've got a problem there, because that's not the way Jewish law works. Now, that would have been well and good, and we could have wrapped up 10 minutes early. However, the translation goes on to make things even more complicated and problematic. And well, let's see what the translator said. And I should point out right at the beginning that in the original Hebrew, the word blood does not appear in any one of these sentences. Do not raise the objection that there was no need to write extra words or letters to include all these different levels of proselytes and the offspring of their unions, seeing that even a total proselyte, one in whose veins not a drop of Jewish blood flows, is subject to this legislation. Right? So the argument, before we get to the problem, the argument is, why do you think we need to actually list this anyway? As soon as you tell me an actual, honest to goodness convert by him or herself is subject to this, then certainly any other degree of convert would also be implied as being obligated to this. Now he's going to argue why it's necessary, but I just want to point out the problem here of drop of Jewish blood flows, right? The veins and drop of Jewish blood flows is not in the original text, right? The Or HaChaim did not write that phrase at all in his original text. The translator decided that to translate the phrase, the convert himself, that the only way that atzmo himself could be translated as being, well, what he really meant was there wasn't Jewish blood. But Or HaChaim is never talking about Jewish blood. He is not talking about some Jewish status being conveyed through blood. He is talking, yes, about people who converted without having any other connection to Judaism within their family history and family tree. But he is not talking about blood, DNA, biology, or anything like that. However, this modern translator, reading it through modern lens and reading it through modern fixation on blood and race and other issues of what is in our biology, unfortunately has slipped, whether consciously or unconsciously, into the error of imagining that somehow our ancestors were also equally fixated on the concept of what was running through our veins. Now, it is absolutely true that Judaism cares about blood in the sense that when you kill someone, that needs to be accounted for with justice, or that when you kill an animal, that we not eat the blood that has been shed from the animal. But to imagine that there was any Jewishness in the blood is simply not found in any of the early or even late Jewish writings until we begin to reach the modern period, where unfortunately we absorb this concept from those who used it against us. The concept of Jewish blood, of drops of Jewish blood, was born more from those who hated Jews than from those who loved them. And that is, I believe, probably unconsciously where this concept began to creep into this translation. But let's go ahead and finish the translation, and I'll try to unpack what I believe Or HaChaim was actually trying to say while pointing out why what the translator did was so problematic. If it had not been for the extra word ish, the ish, which tells us that proselytes mentioned in this verse were second-generation proselytes, that is to say, those whose father or mother or both had already been Jewish at the time they were conceived, I would not have known all this, meaning that I did need the extra information because of the extra ish. Having written the extra ish enabled the Torah to describe that there are different levels of proselytes, the most spiritually endowed being the ones in whose veins there flows some blood of a natural born Jew. Again, that phrase completely lacking in the original Hebrew. These are followed by the proselytes in which no such blood of natural-born Jews flows at all. Again, not in the Hebrew, simply saying that whether they had a parent or didn't have a parent. You may ask, whence do we know that a female child whose father was a proselyte and whose mother was a natural-born Jewess that is subject to this legislation? Answer, if even a proselyte in whose veins no Jewish blood flows at all is included in the above legislation, there was no need to add further dimensions, letters, or of an inclusive nature to add such people to the groups of people covered by our verse. Don't worry too much. We already sort of covered that last bit of information, but just see that in the last sentence there, or last sentence in 2, you can remove the phrase with the veins with Jewish blood, and it actually makes perfect sense. You may ask, whence do we know that a female child whose father was a proselyte and whose mother was a natural-born Jewess is subject to this legislation? No blood mentioned, because you should not be thinking of blood, because our ancestors were not thinking of blood. They thought that, yes, there were certain spiritual, holy ideas and concepts, mystical ideas that were wrapped up in parentage, but it had nothing to do with the DNA, nothing to do with biology, nothing to do with the flowing of blood from one body to the next. And that concept would have been completely foreign to them. The idea that heritage mattered, yes, that they understood, but not heritage based off blood, and certainly not heritage based off blood and racial ideas as those are used in modern world. So if the translator had simply said the offspring of unions and of people who weren't born from those unions, we would have been left with a much closer translation of Or HaChaim's opinion. Now, that opinion is still very problematic and, in my opinion, wrong, because there is not a mystical distinction between those who converted and those who didn't, and those born of converts and those who weren't. There is not some supernatural element that is missing in one group or another, or in smaller supply in one group or another. However, for the translator to introduce this racial blood concept is extremely problematic, and something that when reading translations, we need to be very much on guard of. That we should not be tempted to read ancient texts as though they are speaking to the same concepts, needs, and issues that are found in modern conversations. Sometimes that makes it very hard. Like I said, it's easier for us as moderns to believe that Or HaChaim was talking about some sort of genetic heritage than it is for us to believe in a mystical, intangible, supernatural heritage that was his actual focus. However, that was probably what he actually meant, that there was an intangible, mystical issue, one which I disagree with, and many other authors disagree with as well, but that was probably what he was talking about. But to contaminate that with modern fixation is really a huge flaw in the way this commentary was translated for modern audiences. All right, so I'll get off my soapbox. We'll leave it there for the moment, but I want to open it up for questions and comments as needed.
Rabbi, when I was looking at this, if we look at the translated word sanctity as more ritual purity, we're seeing that there are different, even with argument, there are all these different types of isha, we still have the general rule following up, no matter what type of ish you are, you're still a nefesh.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
so even with all of these distinctions, everybody, who does this, every soul who does this is still going to be subject to the same correct. It's
and
still
right. Exactly. And
that's my
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I finished my thought. Thanks.
Okay, I was just going to say, and that's the danger of reading somebody who was at the threshold of the modern world as though he was in the modern world. Because he probably would have agreed and would have been shocked if someone would have introduced this blood concept. Because he would have agreed that, yes, a nefesh is a nefesh is a nefesh, that a soul is a soul is a soul. Right. On the other hand, he was at the threshold where people began to doubt that concept, where people began to emphasize distinctions in souls. And that is part of the outcome of, after about 1,000 years worth of subjugation and brutality through the Christian Europe and the Crusades in particular, followed by the Inquisition, and then followed by the ghettoization and the slaughter and expulsion of Jews from so many communities, there were some voices that began to say, these people are not real people, right? These souls that are committing these atrocities are not real souls. And as a voice of despair from a victimized people, I can understand and sympathize with the feeling that gave rise to that type of study. It's a shame because it contaminates much of what the Torah tries to tell us about the nature of human souls and the unity of our souls as all being connected to God. But at least it is understandable. However, even that was done through a mystical dimension, which is easier to reconcile with older Jewish concepts. Once it moves into a biological and physical dimension, then we are off to the races to racism. And we are off to the races in ways that are unfortunately all too familiar to Jews with the pain and suffering that comes in its wake. So really the translator ought to have known better. And I know that it's hard to try and translate ancient works and find good ways to render them into clear English that capture the meaning of the original, but this was not it. All right, everyone, take care, be well, and be good to each other.
Thank you, Rabbi.